Great. Okay. Wait till a few more people pop on here before I intro. I see some people are getting on right now. We just went live. There's so much nature behind people. It's it's really nice. And Bill and there is behind me too. I just have walls in the way.
That's what I do. Yeah. I was like chasing one link down.
Okay. All right, so I'll start introducing right now. Looks like we have quite a few folks on. So I'm Jennifer Brandt. I coordinated the summit this year. The theme is climate change, as most of you should know if you registered for this talk. Bill initially was just going to be doing a pre-recorded session for us, but a very bizarre silver lining to the COVID is that he's able to be here via Zoom link. So we're very excited to have him here and have him speak live to all of us and be able to answer a couple questions as well. So really excited to have him. He needs no introduction. He is our rock star. He is our David Bowie. He is our John Lennon of climate change. I will have Lissa go ahead and say a few words as well. And go ahead, Lissa.
Sure. Hi, I'm Lissa Harris. I'm the Executive Director at Strolling of the Heifers. I don't have much to say that Jen didn't already say. Thank you so much, Bill, for coming and agreeing to talk. Welcome to everyone who is attending, and I think we should just get right into it.
Well, what a pleasure for me to get to join you all. Greetings from Addison County and up on the edge of the Green Mountain National Forest. You can see the woods behind me. I'm out on the porch. It's kind of a pretty day, though some rain may come. There's always the possibility that I will disappear from your screen at some point because, you know, we take one part of the slow living thing that Vermont takes very seriously is slow internet. And you never know when things are just going to disappear. But if it does, I will do my valiant best to get back with you. I'm very glad, you know, it's been, I mean, look, the most fun is when we all can be together. And I have really enjoyed over the years being in Brattleboro and getting to take part in all of this and being at the theater and so on and so forth. But there's something to be said, even without a pandemic, for learning how to do more of these things via things like low carbon Zoom. And this year, of course, we have no choice. We're living through one of the most interesting, trying, well, we're living through the most different period that any of us have lived through in our lifetimes. Those of us, at least, who can't remember back to World War II or the Depression before it, we're in a very, very, very odd spot that teaches all kinds of lessons, some of them about, you know, if you had asked anybody a year ago, could you imagine America changing this much, this fast? People would have honestly had to say, no, that's possible. I can't imagine a world where no one I know has gotten on an airplane for 3 months or no one's been to their office or whatever it is. It's a very different world. And one of the things that we've learned is that we're capable of living in very different worlds and doing it perhaps somewhat more gracefully and easily than we might have imagined. It's not been easy. And of course, for some people who've contracted this terrible disease, it's been truly horrible. And for plenty of others who've lost their jobs, it's been just as hard as can be. But people have, well, they've done an interesting job of changing their lives. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, there's no silver linings to a pandemic, but let's talk for a minute about a few of the things that I think we may have learned along the way a little bit. First one of them is, how to say it, reality is real. That's a hard thing once in a while for us to remember, because we live in a world with screens everywhere, and we're forever editing and shifting and moving around, and and for most people, water is long since something that comes from a faucet, and food something that comes out of a market. And so reality itself seems easy to take for granted. I've been arguing, of course, for 30 years, since I wrote the first book on climate change, that physics and chemistry are not negotiable. We don't get to change them around just because we want to. They don't compromise. They're just real. They do what they do. And of course, the COVID microbe reminds us that the same is true of biology. You don't get to set the limits, and we've watched our president try. He said, oh, the whole thing's a hoax, or it'll go away by Easter, or the number of cases will drop to 0, or if you drink this bottle of hydroxy something or another, or if you inject yourself with bleach, or if you put sunlight inside you or something, then everything will be okay. But of course, that's nonsense, because that's not how biology works. Biology is real, and it sets the rules. If it says wear a mask, then wear a mask. That's important. To have a basic grounding in reality in the 21st century is going to be very key, because it's going to help us deal with the much more overarching crisis of climate change that's coming at us hard and fast. Second rule, second lesson, corollary maybe to the first, and this is one I hesitate to bring up at Slow Living, but here we go. Sometimes speed matters a good deal, and that you do have to move. Physical reality forces you to move fast. So we watch what happened with the coronavirus and the flattening of the virus curve. Those South Korea and the US had their first fatality from coronavirus on the same day in late January. Well, the South Koreans went right to work. They'd been attuned by the SARS epidemic a decade or so ago, they needed to do, and they did it. They stopped everybody from having large meetings and tested the hell out of everyone so they could trace what was going on. And it hasn't worked perfectly. There's still cases there. Several hundred people have died in South Korea, but it worked out pretty darn well compared to what happened here, which is that we wasted all of February pretending that things would go away, or pretending that we had plenty of time to react, or whatever it was. And because of that failure, we ended up in the worst of all worlds. We had to disrupt things far more than we otherwise would have. We had to disrupt them far more than Korea. We had to send everybody home. We had to lock down the whole country. And B, even having done that huge disruption, because we'd waited so long, we have enormous trauma. We have big pile of dead bodies and all the sadness that goes with that. There was a story in the Times last week estimating that had we locked things down 1 week earlier, we would have had 35,000 fewer deaths in this country. So it's a reminder that speed matters. And of course, that's been clear all along in the climate fight. For February in the climate fight, substitute the last 30 years. That's when we had our fair warning from scientists, and that's when we did nothing. Those are the 3 decades that we've wasted, which means now we have to go faster and harder than ever. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us, they said in their report in October of 2018, that if we had not made fundamental transformations of our energy systems by 2030, and they defined fundamental transformation as cutting emissions in half, if we hadn't done it by 2030, then our chances of meeting the targets that we'd set in Paris in 2015 were essentially nil. That means we're going to have to compress the work we should have been doing over the last 3 decades into 1 decade. And that's going to be obviously very hard. And it's going to be much more disruptive than if we'd started in when we should have. And even when we make that disruption, it's still going to come with a lot of trauma. We're not getting out of this one unscathed. The scathing is already well underway. It's a little hard to remember now, given all that we've lived through in this annus horribilis 2020, that the year began as we watched slack-jawed the continent of Australia half burned to the ground. But we're in deep hot water. And so speed is required. The third lesson, maybe most important, and this one much more congenial, I think, to most of what we think about when we think about slow living, is that social solidarity really matters, that you have to come together. Now, you know, I'm old enough that I kind of grew up in the political shadow of Ronald Reagan. And I think in a sense, all of us have. He kind of reset our politics. And the most important idea that came out of his time, him and Margaret Thatcher and a few others, was that, that markets solved all problems, that the role of individuals was to pursue their own self-interest, that we weren't responsible for each other. Just the contrary. I mean, Reagan's famous laugh line in all his speeches was, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Ha ha ha. It was dumb when he said it, but now it sounds really ridiculous because we know that there's a lot scarier sentences like, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house caught on fire. And we do not solve those by individual pursuit of wealth. We do not solve those by the action of markets. We solve them when we come together to make things change. So now we'll see if we can come together. And let's think about some of the lessons that we've learned from these last weeks in our own lives. One of them clearly is that you know, a slower pace of living is exceedingly possible. And people have, I think, grappled with that pretty darn well. I mean, you know, yes, there are knuckleheads out insisting on, you know, changing nothing and going to the bar and standing, you know, 10 deep in the swimming pool and whatever else. But except for really essential things like protesting to keep police from, you know, overrunning our lives, most people have been pretty responsible. And to a certain degree, I think a lot of people have found a certain kind of undeniable pleasure in a world that's slowed down some. Hence the endless Instagram images, more than you might at this point want, of people's loaves of sourdough bread or whatever it is, okay? Those are a sign of people making an adjustment. And we've all learned that we can do lots of things in different ways. There's not a person left in America, I don't think, who doesn't have some skills with Zoom now, and hence understand that, you know, you probably don't need an hour-and-a-half commute each way every day of your life to get done the work that needs doing. You can do a lot of it from a distance and much more elegantly. There's a lot of people who've rediscovered that there are things around their homes, that their places where they live, that are a reasonable substitute for jumping on an airplane and heading to the Caribbean. I don't get that upset when I see the pictures of parking lots at hiking trailheads filled with cars. I don't actually think that many people are going to give each other coronavirus hiking in the woods. And I think it's a good reminder that people really seek out things that matter to them. And, you know, contact with each other and contact with the natural world are both really important. We've been denied, to a certain degree, contact with each other in this stretch, and that's been very hard. The human impulse in times of crisis or disaster is to come together. Rebecca Solnit's beautiful book, Paradise Built in Hell, is a wonderful chronicle of how time after time, faced with disaster, people organized even without the help of governments to get things done, and got there before governments could. All of us in Vermont remember what the response to Hurricane Irene was like and what that felt like as we mobilized to get done what needed doing. We've had this strange case here where the most important thing we can do for each other is stay apart. And as that goes away, as we're allowed to come back together, I actually hope that one of the results is that we'll remember that we want to be gregarious in a way. Because, you know, Americans have been engaging in social distancing long before the coronavirus. I mean, what's a world where you mostly just live through the thing in your palm, you know, looking at your phone or your computer? That's kind of like social distancing. The average American has half as many friends as the average American in the 1950s. That's a big difference for a socially evolved primate. So maybe we'll recapture some of that back. And of course, one of the things we've learned is that when we slow down some, carbon emissions begin to drop, and that's good. We've seen reductions in pollution of all kinds over these last weeks, and you've all seen the pictures. There are people around the world who have had the first lungful of clean air they've ever breathed in their lives, in cities like Delhi, say, or whatever, where the air is always terrible, and all of a sudden, for a while, it was clean. Those are really important things. Now, the other side to that is emissions didn't go down all that much, not as much as one might have expected. I mean, we basically locked down our economy around the world for a couple of months. I don't know a soul who's gotten on an airplane for weeks upon weeks. Driving is down sharply, all across country, on and on and on. And yet, carbon emissions dropped at their peak about 15%. So that's not nothing. 15% is good. That helps, but it's now going right back up as we get back to work. More to the point, what it really demonstrates, I think, is that there is a limit as to what we're capable of doing with individual action here. That a great large percentage of our emissions are essentially hardwired into the systems around us. So that even if we're off airplanes, even, that the just basic running of our world at this point, even when it kind of half goes to sleep, even when the screensaver comes on our planet, still takes 80%, 85% of the carbon that we were burning before. So that means that we're going to have no choice but to accompany our individual efforts at change with the work of going into the guts of these systems and rewiring them, making sure that we take out the coal and gas and oil and put in the insulation and put in the sun and the wind that allow us to power our world on less energy and on clean energy. And those are tasks that we can't avoid. So that mathematical lesson's been, to me, quite interesting and profound. It's always good to learn new things. And the opportunity for change right now is probably higher than it's almost ever been. For one thing, we have an extraordinary and now and very sad army of unemployed people, 40 million Americans have lost their jobs in the last 12 weeks. And not all of them will get them back easily, no matter what happens. And the same is true in much of the rest of the world. If you cast about for the set of tasks that might require that many hands to get them done, that we might profitably put back to work doing something. Really, the list of tasks I think that you can constructively come up with begins and ends with transforming the planet's energy system. That's the biggest job that we face. And the good news is that it's entirely possible to imagine doing it. You know, the engineers have done a good job in the last decade. They've dropped the price of solar power and wind power by 80 or 90%. It's now the cheapest way to generate power around much of the world. And that's a real miracle in a lot of ways. We don't always realize it that much because for us, a solar panel just replaces something else that was there before. But I've gotten to spend some time in the last few years in those parts of the world that never had power and never were going to get it if they were waiting for the grid to come to where they were. I'm talking about the huge swaths of rural Africa, say, where 600 million people live without electricity. And they're getting it now much, much faster than anyone had anticipated, precisely because the price of solar panels dropped so fast and so sharply. But all of a sudden, it makes sense, makes possible for people. And when you're in those places, then you get a sense of what it means. I remember being in Ghana a couple of years ago, right near the equator, northern Ghana. So it was hot all the time, especially for Vermont. Like me, it's hot as hell. On a village that the week before, or maybe even the day before, had gotten its first electricity ever from a small solar array, about 40 panels that was powering a wire that was going to each hut in this community. And I was sitting with the village elders talking about it, and one of these people, an old man, kept handing me cold bottles of water to drink, for which I was very grateful because it was hot as can be. But it took me about 15 minutes in my clueless Western way to realize why he was so proud to be handing me those bottles. There'd never been anything cold in their village before because there'd never been a refrigerator before. When you see it that way, and the main thing the refrigerator was storing was vaccines, by the way. And I will tell you, as far as I can tell, there are no anti-vaxxers out in the hinterlands of places like Ghana. People are only too happy to get to try and save their children. When you saw that, you got some sense of what a miracle this is. You can point a sheet of glass at the sun, and out the back comes cold and information and light and things. That's a Hogwarts scale miracle, okay? And we don't appreciate it so much, but we should. Because it's now so cheap, we could really imagine a world where we went to work doing that kind of work. And that's what young people around the world are now demanding. I think of my young friends at the Sunrise Movement. These were the people who, when they were in colleges around the country, were coordinating campus fossil fuel divestment campaigns everywhere. One of the most successful campaigns that anti-corporate campaigns that we've ever had. We're at $14 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested, and it's put huge pressure on the fossil fuel industry. And I'm so grateful to all of you who've taken part. Anyway, the kids who got out of that got graduated from school, wanted to keep on with the fight, and they formed this thing called the Sunrise Movement, and it's from them that we get this Green New Deal. They were the ones who recruited Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're the kind of wonderful multiracial bands of people demanding quick action, demanding that we move with real speed to change because it's their futures that are on the line. Look, I'm clearly going to be dead before this climate change reaches the absolute apex. But if you're in high school or college now, you're going to be at the absolute prime of your life when you should be doing whatever it is that you're training to do, but instead you'll just be engaging in emergency response unless we get our act together and fast. That's why they're pushing so hard for renewable energy, for retrofitting buildings across America to make sure that they're energy efficient, to reforming the ways that we do agriculture so that we lock soil in the ground instead of spewing it in the atmosphere, on and on and on. A series of systemic interventions that give us some hope of changing and changing fast. And as we do, building a very different world. I'll tell you that one of the things I like about sun and wind is that they don't produce carbon, so that's good and we have to have them. I'll tell you another thing I like about them, which is that they're ubiquitous. They're available everywhere. And that's good because it means that the small number of people who happen to sit atop the deposits of coal and oil and gas will no longer control the world in quite the same way once we move in that direction. No one will have to pay attention to the king of Saudi Arabia or to the Koch brothers, who are our biggest oil and gas barons. Instead, we'll be able to supply one of our most important commodities from close to home, from where we are. Local electrons are as beautiful as local food. And you wouldn't want to waste either one, you'd want to use them wisely and well and in celebratory fashion. So it's time to stop burning things, coal, gas, oil, biomass, anything else, and time to be pleased with the fact that there's a great ball of gas burning 70 miles away that we can take full advantage of, and as we do, build a more just society. And that's where I want to just end with a couple of minutes. The events of the last couple of weeks are really important for us to take in. These calls around solidarity are not empty or formal or anything else. They're as real as the knee of that policeman on the neck of that guy in Milwaukee, George Floyd, in Minneapolis, George Floyd. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker this week talking about some of these connections and talking about this idea of breath, People can't breathe when someone kneels on their neck. People can't breathe when there's a coal-fired power plant in their neighborhood. Both those things are far more likely to be happening to vulnerable people, people of color in our society. Black Americans have 3 times the rate of asthma that white Americans do. And of course, that's who gets hit hardest and first by climate change as well. Racism is just as much a pollutant that has just as much physical effect as carbon molecules or particulates or anything else. And we have the studies to prove it. Can you imagine what it does to your levels of stress hormones and hence everything else to live in a neighborhood where you're always worried that someone's going to be about to arrest you for nothing or hit you with a stick or whatever it is? So our job is to solve these problems together and to solve them speedily. And the ways that we do that are by building community, which can only be done paradoxically with a certain amount of slowness and attention and care. But the clock is definitely ticking in every respect. So no time to waste, and that means moving with steadfastness and with a certain amount of courage. We don't know, frankly, that we can win these fights, especially the climate fight. We've waited a long time to get started on it. We are behind. But There are a lot of us now joining in these movements to make change happen. A lot of us realizing that in certain ways, the most important thing individuals can do is be less individuals and more, to more join together with others in movements big enough to matter. And if we do, then at least we have a chance, not to stop climate change at this point, it's too late for that, but to stop it short of the point where it overwhelms civilizations. Even that is an open question at this point. It's going to take everything we have to slow it down, but we shall try. So I am extraordinarily grateful to you all for the work that I know you all do. And I know that this is a really profound and great community that's come together over the years to accomplish real things and to think things through in deliberate and powerful ways. And we've never needed it more than we do right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was incredible and compelling and very inspiring. We do have some questions already, so if it's okay with you, I'll just jump right into the questions.
Yep.
So we have Jeffrey Haverly, who says, thank you so much. So very glad to have heard you. How do I convince my fellow citizens that if we do not make the right decision on November 3, that we will go down as the last generation not to act to prevent climate crisis?
Well, that's a good question. And Jeffrey, I don't know where you are or what your circumstance is, but I'm going to guess that for most people listening here, the question on November 3rd is not, should I going to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump? It's going to be, should I vote for Joe Biden or should I not bother voting or vote for some third party or whatever else? And I got to tell you, I think it's, I utterly agree with Bernie that we need to be working hard for Joe Biden right now and through November 3rd. Not because he's going to solve all our problems, he isn't, but because he's the kind of person that you can pressure once he's elected. You know, Bernie asked me to introduce him in 2016, the day he announced he was running for president. The people who got to introduce him, I think, were me and Ben and Jerry by the shore of Lake Champlain. But I remember telling him when he called, you know, as usual, things were a little rushed, and he called me a night or two before to say, will you come up to Lake, Burlington, introduce me? Like, yep, I will, but you got to know, I'll not only introduce you, I'll work hard to try and get you elected president, but you've got to know that if you're elected, 6 months later, I'll be chained to your gate at the White House demanding that you take action. And he said, to his credit, I wouldn't have it any other way. And that's why, Bernie is the great leader he is. And that's why that's why it's so important to elect people that you indeed can pressure. I didn't, love Hillary Clinton last time around. I understood all the problems with her, just like I understand all the problems with Biden. He wasn't my choice, obviously, this time around either. But I also know that he's open to that kind of pressure. When Barack Obama was elected, I supported him. And then I organized with others what turned out to be the biggest demonstrations outside the White House during his presidency to try and get him to stop the Keystone Pipeline. And he did. We didn't bother doing that with Donald Trump. It wouldn't have done the slightest good. There's no possibility. What was he going to do? Like look out the window and say, oh, you're right. Obviously, when people come protest, what he does is, tear gas them and then wander around like a moron with the Bible that held upside down. That's what you get. So our job is to elect people and then to go to work, and it's not just the president. We better make sure that Mitch McConnell's not running the Senate either next time around. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're hanging on by the skin of our teeth with judges and courts and things. You want 4 more years of, this is as serious as it gets. And so I know everybody will be working hard, at least I hope they will, as we get through November. And then on November 4th, we got to keep working, because politics is not synonymous with elections, and politics doesn't end the day that elections end. In some ways, it begins. We haven't been able to do anything like that under Trump. That's why it's so important to get him out of there. I see a question about solar panels and disposing of toxic chemicals. And then I see a question from Alex Wilson. So what we really should do is have Alex answer the question about how to responsibly dispose of toxic chemicals from solar panel discussion, because what do I know about, toxic chemicals from solar panel production? I know that there's no free lunch, and that solar panels have been are a messy business to make, and I know that we can do them better, and I know we're slowly getting better at doing them, but we need to try and do them as fast as we can. Clearly, that's not an argument, though, not to have solar panels. If we don't produce as much energy as we can from the sun and the wind, then the temperature will go up so high that none of our other environmental problems will matter in the least. So that's why we triage a lot in order to deal, in order to get where we're going. That said, I'm pretty sure that Alex will have some sense of where the state of the art is now on greener, cleaner solar panel production, if he wants to chime in.
Sure, glad to chime in. First of all, I think that, that the toxics from solar panel production is greatly exaggerated. I think manufacturers have done a very good job, most of them, not all, most of them, in cleaning up production over the last 10 or 15 years. There's a lot of misinformation by the anti-solar people claiming that, oh, solar is just as bad as anything else. And that's just not the case. If you want to talk about toxics of manufacturing, look at the toxics that go into manufacturing coal-fired power plants or extracting coal from the ground. Anyway, so I think that's a little bit displaced, but clearly the industry has worked hard to clean up its act and is doing, I think, a pretty good job at it.
That's
Back
good.
to you, Bill.
Very good to hear. And I can tell you that it's not at all true of the fossil fuel industry, which continues to fight every possibility, every way, even to minimally clean up the filth around what they do. To watch them, for instance, struggle to keep the federal government from regulating in any way, even counting the amount of methane that they're producing from fracking wells and things is obscene. Alex, in the chat, in the Q&A, asked a good question, a really important one that I think he's, again, probably has smart things to say about, but it's the, if COVID-19 has shown us anything, now the question just disappeared, but if COVID-19 has shown us anything, it's that awareness of science is important. How do we transfer that to climate science? And it's exactly true. It's funny, I've been watching online and talking with some of the epidemiologists and introducing a few of them who I know to climate scientists, just so they can get a sense of how to deal with the sort of cascade of misinformation and craziness, Climate scientists have had to learn to come to grips with this. Epidemiologists, medical doctors are, I'm afraid, just now learning kind of the depths of internet nuttiness about these kind of topics, But the basic understanding, I think, it's what I was trying to get at before, the most basic ideas that reality is real and that you have to move on it with speed. I think that those things have kind of gotten through. When we look at the polling, the only people anybody trusts in our country about anything right now are scientists. They're the only people whose polling is, above water as credible suspects about anything. So hopefully we'll come out of this whole thing with our sense of the power of science somewhat enhanced. Um, Michael says, following up on Alex's question, behavioral change is important. COVID-19 has shown the reluctance of a preponderance of people to act for the good of all. If we can't inspire action for direct human health, how will we be able to inspire people to act to limit climate change? Well, I think here I may disagree a little bit with the premise of the question. I think actually most people have shown up, have done what they're supposed to be doing. When I go to the, down into town, everybody's wearing a mask, and doing it in part to protect themselves, but in part because they understand it's important to protect other people. Now, look, there are ideological corners in this country where that's not true. And again, it demonstrates the bad mistake it is to put a buffoon in charge of the nation. The fact that the president won't wear a mask obviously makes people less likely to do it themselves, introduces that kind of element of doubt and things. But I actually been pretty impressed with the fact that most people hunkered down and did what they were supposed to do, and under hard circumstances. So I think we should take a moment to kind of celebrate the solidarity that we have seen and hope that we can build on it. November 3rd is going to be a very interesting election because there are two possibilities here. One is we're going to go further down the road we've been traveling these last 30 or 40 years of just endless atomization, endless kind of paranoia and craziness about things, or we're going to begin to take a significant step back from that and say, you know what, maybe we got burned some. It won't happen overnight. No political change ever happens overnight, but that'll be a significant moment. We'll see if we can keep, we'll see if we can restore a little bit of reason. Anne asked, if Biden wins, what's next for the movement? What should the first 100 days be like? These are precisely the questions that people are hard at work on now. And really the person to follow, the person I'm paying most attention to, is an old friend of mine, a young woman named Varshini Prakash, head of the Sunrise Movement. She's one of Bernie's sort of delegates to this climate panel that they've worked out between Biden and Bernie. John Kerry and Gina McCarthy and others are on it too, and it's a pretty good panel, I think. But they're coming up with precisely a list of ideas. The thing I most want to see on day one, and Biden has promised it, is an end to drilling for oil, gas, mining for coal on public lands in this country. The president can do that. No new permits get granted. Doesn't have to ask Congress or anybody else. And it's not a trivial matter. The US public lands in this country, the National Forests, the Bureau of Land Management lands, taken together are the fourth largest source of carbon in the world after the US as a whole, Russia and Saudi Arabia. So that would be a huge change, and it would happen day one. John writes, you wrote recently about the work of Gene Sharp and how we may need to use that to respond to the current administration. Yes, I had a piece in the New Yorker yesterday about someone I greatly admire, the late Gene Sharp, who is kind of the best chronicler of nonviolent action in this world, and just talking about the endless list of examples he's had from the history of the last 100 years since Gandhi and Dr. King and others started pioneering nonviolent social movements, about how you can make big, nasty, disruptive trouble for authoritarians. And it's possible we're going to need to be doing precisely that. I don't think it should be, my wife has a piece in the New Yorker today pointing out that we should not take for granted that we're going to have an election this November or that the results of that election will be respected. We don't know, and we need to be very vigilant and very coordinated. And you can see some good signs of that even this week as everybody comes together around things like Black Lives Matter. There's some good organizing and coordinating going on, and there'll need to be much more because in my experience, narcissists don't surrender their objects of their affection easily. And I think I fear it may be an even more turbulent time. It was not encouraging to see the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff marching with Trump on their charade of a hike across Lafayette Square the other night. So we may have to do a lot of work to make sure that cooler heads prevail. I just want to thank you all. These are fantastic questions. And the work that everybody in this coalition has done over the years has been just so amazing. Bless you for it. On we go, and I'll look forward to the next opportunities. And maybe by next year, who knows, we'll be able to see each other and give each other a hug, which would be nice.
I want to thank you again, Bill. I'm actually originally from Addison County, so I recognize some of those trees around there. Also, as an Indigenous person living in Brooklyn right now, I've been marching and going to vigils every night. So thank you so much for calling that out. It's really important.
Well, here we are on, Abenaki land, and it's remember that from time to time. It's good to remember it for lots of reasons, including that it just provides a deep, powerful history for all of us. Humans have been here a long time and figured out ways to live on this land that works, which means we can probably do it again if we see it.
Agreed.
Cheers, y'all.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Just want to remind all the attendees that the recording will be available for folks. And also to thank our sponsors, Breakthrough Beverage, for letting us put on all of these presentations that we'll be doing for the next week. And thank you to everyone who attended.
That's it for today, but we'll be back tomorrow.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, everybody.